So like I do actually have a script, but also I've had a bit to drink, so um I might go off the cuff a little bit. Right, let's roll. So this year, instead of doing tissue thin top and bottom lists of the films I saw this year, for some reason always fucking six, I've decided to just make one long list with every film I saw that was released in 2018. Incidentally, if you don't see a film on this list, it's because I didn't see it. Obviously. I'm honestly kind of surprised at how many films I saw this year, given that I was both dirt poor and offensively busy with graduating, and then immediately jumping back into even higher education. Some of these films I actually have very little to say regarding, but hey, we'll roll with it. So, the first film I want to talk about is easily the worst film I ended up seeing this year, objectively speaking. Venom was an utter embarrassment to both the superhero genre and filmmaking in general. While not as actively abhorrent as The Mummy from last year, it's certainly the least competent film I saw this year. A film later in the list will do the whole predator stuck inside a normal dude's brain shtick much better, though it's not particularly hard. With that said, this movie's fucking hilarious. I had a whale of a time watching this movie in the cinema, and I'm certainly not above turning my brain off and enjoying some shit content. Now, don't misunderstand me. Venom is shit, but I actually found that I liked it more than A Star Is Born, which was an excessively manipulative wank fantasy to watch Bradley Cooper emphasize how talented he is. Now, I like Bradley Cooper, and I'm glad we're agreed he seems like a cool guy, but his direction of this film is mediocre, pedestrian, run-of-the-mill, and the story constantly paints his character as some sort of wounded warrior, and I really didn't buy it. Lady Gaga was great, incredible even, but she can't save an unlikable lead and frustrating writing. I really wanted it to be good, but alas, I really didn't like this film. And to be honest, as someone who relates to the themes that are portrayed in this movie to quite a large degree, I'm offended at how bad they was at expressing those, at least to me personally. This film was without question my least favourite movie of the year, and it can thank its lucky fucking stars that Venom was so objectively bad. So we've had the worst film and the least favourite film, so the only thing left is the most disappointing film. I feel like I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but Incredibles 2 was tragic. Watching it in the cinema was like watching something you love get burned right in front of you. With a plot that stops and starts 3 times, it feels like 3 potential sequel ideas for Incredibles that have been merged into one, and it really fucking shows. This film isn't poorly made by any stretch, but it is soulless and forgettable. Pixar need to get themselves out of whatever rut they've been in, because after Coco, this is a massive step back. It feels like a business decision. Superheroes are popular and we have superheroes, so let's make a movie. And it feels that way so much so that I'm not convinced I saw the real Incredibles 2. One thing I did definitely see was Illumination's Grinch, because the humour was bland and pretty pathetic. What saves this film, to me, is probably my favourite depiction of the Grinch in cinema, because it's a nice mix between being sympathetic, being a dick, and being kinda likeable. The sub-story with the kids is utter tripe, and there are embarrassing attempts at forced humour that you may expect from Illumination Picture all throughout this bullshit. But again, I really did warm to this depiction of the Grinch. And I honestly prefer it to the Jim Carrey Grinch if we're talking solely based on the characters. Fucking food, right? One thing that probably is worth mentioning in this list is that a lot of these movies I saw at the end of the year, which is where I have more free time and movie rentals get cheaper and cheaper. This is how I experienced Game Night, the open quotes dark comedy, which honestly isn't actually all that dark. It has some gigglesome lines, but for a dark comedy, I'd have liked it to push the envelope a bit more. Also, the fake Irish accent that one of the characters uses is both very poor and very distracting. Is this movie bad? I don't know about that, but it's certainly not great. I'd be surprised if I end up quoting this film later down the line. Unless, of course, I'm taking the piss out of that fucking horrendous Irish accent. Final Score was a film based around the premise of what if Die Hard, but in a London football stadium. Any film which draws comparisons to Die Hard is putting itself in a very unfortunate position, and sure enough, Final Score does not reach that high caliber of film. Dave Bautista isn't as likable as Bruce Willis, the villains aren't nearly as memorable as the Gruber Gang, and the film takes itself so seriously that it has basically no personality with the exception of Faisal. His character is what I'll remember, immediately sympathetic and likable. To stick with the Die Hard comparisons, he's like if Argyle was actively helping McClane. The action is palpable, and the film has a surprising amount of balls for some genuinely disturbing deaths. Is it bad? No, I don't think so. There's definitely enough cheesy fun to be had with some of the overly ridiculous action scenes, but there's just not enough personality to make this film something I'll remember. Except for the fight in the kitchen. That scene kicks ass. On the subject of movies with football as an underpinning narrative point, let's talk about another animated movie next. Early Man, the latest claymation vehicle from the geniuses at Aardman. And yeah, it's alright. It's not bad. It's charming and it's full of subtle and dry British humour. Shout out to the caveman called Asbo, by the way. That is a great joke. But probably the blandest and least interesting and inventive of the Aardman movies. It feels more like a British take on the Flintstones than a fully unique creative idea, and given the pedigree of these people, that's a massive shame. I don't know if part of it is that I'm not into football, or part of it is just the less creative setting, which puts the humour and creative set pieces through the ringer a bit, but this was a pretty okay film. After watching Early Man, I went back to watch the pirate movie that they did, which has a different name everywhere, because that's a good marketing strategy, and it felt so much more fresh and creative, so I'd honestly recommend most, if not all, of the other Aardman films over Early Man first. Not bad, not great, alright. It's probably on par with Final Score in terms of quality, in completely different fucking ways, obviously. But I think Early Man takes the edge for being slightly more memorable thanks to the personality that it lends itself. Okay, now we're getting into movies that are pretty unambiguously recommendable, with one exception that I'll get to. It's easy to recommend Hereditary for its effective theming, mise-en-scène, and cinematography, but it wasn't a film that stuck with me to the extent I would have liked. It might have to do with... it might have something to do with everyone bigging this film up beyond a reason, but it was just a solid, well-made movie. It's probably best to go into this film knowing as little as possible, which is why I'm being so vague, but it's pretty fucking pretentious. You have been warned. Just in case you're fans of rather drastic shifts of tone, Deadpool 2 is genuinely quite funny. It's about as far as I'll go, unfortunately. As someone who genuinely did love the first film, the second wasn't as laugh-out-loud funny as the first. Not sure if that was the point or not. It's not bad. The series to me is like the Jump Street series, in that, 21 Jump Street is excellent, and 22 Jump Street is still quite funny, but not as good. Definitely worth it, but not as good, I can't lie. And besides which, the way that they just use Juggernaut, it just seems like a waste of such a cool character who has a lot of potential in this universe. You'll see what I mean. Okay, so this next one, I really wanted to like it more than I did. But I didn't. It was good, but unfortunately it was not a huge mind-blowing experience, as I would have hoped that it would be. Black Panther was a good film, let down primarily by the fact that a Black Panther movie was basically already done as a subplot in Civil War. The world it creates is interesting and the characters are likable, but a movie about Black Panther doesn't have an interesting story about Black Panther, which is a pretty glaring issue. But hey, what do I know? It's definitely worth your time, and you might fall in love with it as much as everyone else did, but for me, it's good. It's solid. Now, as I stated earlier in this diatribe, there is a film better than Venom with a similar theme, and that film is Upgrade. Somewhere in these two films is the recipe for the perfect movie of this type. Venom benefited from a pretty likable voice in the head, while Upgrade has the opposite. The schlubby everyman is more likable than the voice in the head helper dude. It has a unique styling, some brilliant shots, and some excellent direction, but it didn't really click with me as much as I wanted it to. Most of the twists were rather inventive, but the ending is a bittersweet one, in a significantly less satisfying way than, say, La La Land's bittersweet ending was. It's without question worth watching, though, and a bloody good time. If you'll pardon the pun, it's just a gory fucking movie. Again, you've kind of been warned. Let's move on to what feels like the biggest film of the year, Avengers Infinity War. Probably the most ambitious film of the year. It certainly succeeds in a lot of ways, but it also feels a little bloated and tough to roll with. You don't really get the chance to sympathize with a lot of the stories, and there are a lot of stories. It's definitely a film you need to watch multiple times, which might have something to do with my somewhat lukewarm response, but ultimately I would say this film is worth it for the end game. Now, for the top two movies. As tends to be the case with this sort of thing, the top two can be pretty interchangeable, but I've ordered them like this for rather long-winded reasons, so I'll try and keep it as succinct as possible. My second favourite film of the year is Searching, which was a breath of fresh air, a creative missing person thriller, phenomenally well acted and captivating. I really did love this film, but I wish I loved it more. I wish there were a smidgen more tension to the film. It's more of a sit back, mindful thriller than a lean forward, heart pounding, edge of your seat thriller. And while that's certainly not a bad thing inherently, it's not what I personally would have liked to see from this film. Consider this little section praised by omission, in that the film, outside of what I'm saying here, is really excellent. It's just not as excellent as my number one film, which will probably be a controversial pick if you look at the Metacritic score. Terminal. I want to have a little rant here, if I can. I'm not normally one to rail against critics, but their reaction to this film is both shameful and fucking embarrassing. The fact that this film has a lower rating than Venom implies to me there's something genuinely wrong with critics just following the money that's thrown at a film. The fact that this little under-the-radar movie I rented for 99p about a week and a half before the end of the year turned out to be one of the more visually stunning, well-acted and captivating movies I've seen in ages is a sign that sometimes these sort of things just work out, regardless of what the critics say. I'm a total sucker for these like neon noir films, so the aesthetic really speaks to me, and it reminds me a lot of the also excellent Filth from a few years ago. Yes, there are a few issues. The story based around the two assassins is not as inherently interesting as the other stories, and unfortunately that has most of the screen time through dint of it being the more complex story. But regardless, Terminal is my film of 2018, a pretty subpar year for movies in terms of them all being pretty mediocre or uninterestingly alright. Rent Terminal for 99p, see what you think, ignore the critics and make up your own mind. Because I did, and I'm really fucking glad I did. So that was 2018. Absolute shit. Hooray. Happy fucking New Year, everyone. Let's hope 2019 isn't total dog shit.